Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something that hits different than your typical betrayal stories. These aren't about someone cheating or lying about small things. We're talking about the people you've given access to your business, your finances, your health, your career, and how they used that access to systematically exploit you for months or years. Grab whatever you're drinking, and let's get into these absolute nightmares. Our first story is about a business partnership where good intentions and charitable work become the perfect cover for something much darker. I'm 36 years old, and my name is Ryan. For the past 7 years, I've been running a successful digital marketing agency with my business partner Trevor, who I met during my MBA program. We started the company right after graduation, each contributing $30,000 in seed money. The business grew steadily, and by year 5, we were generating about $400,000 in annual revenue with a team of 8 employees. Trevor and I had what I thought was a perfect partnership dynamic. I handled the creative side, managing our design team and client campaigns, while Trevor managed operations, finances, and business development. We'd structured the company as a 50-50 partnership with clearly defined roles that played to our respective strengths. Trevor was meticulous about record keeping and financial planning, which I appreciated because numbers weren't my strong suit. About 18 months ago, Trevor came to me with an idea that seemed genuinely altruistic and good for business. He wanted to start a charitable foundation connected to our agency that would provide free marketing services to non-profit organizations. He'd done extensive research on how other agencies use charitable work for tax benefits and positive publicity. The concept was solid. We'd donate a percentage of our time to helping worthy causes, take the tax deductions, and build our reputation as a socially responsible company. Trevor volunteered to handle all the administrative work for setting up the foundation. He said he'd file the necessary paperwork with the IRS, establish the non-profit status, and manage the accounting separately from our main business. I was grateful because I was deep into a major client project and didn't have bandwidth for additional administrative tasks. Trevor seemed genuinely excited about the charitable aspect, talking about how we could make a real difference for organizations that couldn't afford professional marketing services. The foundation launched 6 months later with a small event at a local venue. Trevor had arranged everything, invited local non-profit leaders, and even secured some press coverage. We announced that the Ryan and Trevor Marketing Foundation would be providing free services to qualifying non-profits, with a focus on environmental and educational causes. Several organizations applied for our services, and Trevor handled the selection process and intake procedures. Over the next year, Trevor would occasionally update me about the foundation's activities. He'd mentioned that we'd taken on a new non-profit client, or that he was working on grant applications to fund the foundation's operations. He showed me professionally designed materials with our foundation's branding and talked about the positive feedback we were receiving from the non-profit community. Everything seemed legitimate and well managed. I started noticing some small inconsistencies about 8 months ago. Trevor mentioned that we'd provided services to a children's literacy non-profit, but when I asked our design team about the project, nobody remembered working on anything for that organization. Trevor explained that he'd handled that particular project himself during off hours, because it was a simple website update that didn't require our full team's involvement. Around the same time, I ran into someone at a networking event who mentioned that she'd donated to our foundation after seeing our promotional materials at a fundraising dinner. I was confused because Trevor had never mentioned that we were actively soliciting donations from the public. When I asked him about it, he said he'd been exploring different funding models and had started accepting small donations to cover the foundation's operational costs. He showed me a basic website he'd created for the foundation that included a donation portal. The next red flag came when one of our employees mentioned seeing Trevor at a high-end restaurant on a Saturday afternoon, meeting with someone she described as looking like a wealthy donor. She'd thought it was odd because Trevor was wearing an expensive suit she'd never seen him wear to our office and was driving a car she didn't recognize. When I casually asked Trevor about his weekend, he said he'd spent Saturday working from home on foundation paperwork. I began paying more attention to Trevor's schedule and behavior. He was taking longer lunches, leaving the office early more frequently, and seemed to be spending significant time on phone calls that he'd always step outside to take. When I'd ask what he was working on, he'd mention foundation business or donor cultivation, but his explanations were always vague and didn't include specific details about organizations or projects. 4 months ago, I noticed that our company's accountant seemed confused during a quarterly review meeting. She mentioned some irregularities in how foundation expenses were being categorized and asked if Trevor had been keeping separate books for the non-profit activities. I told her that Trevor was handling all foundation finances independently, and she made a note to follow up with him about proper documentation for our tax filings. The situation started feeling more suspicious when I discovered that Trevor had opened a separate business bank account that I didn't know about. I found out by accident when a bank statement was delivered to our office, addressed to RTM Foundation Operations, with Trevor's name listed as the sole account holder. When I asked him about it, he explained that he'd needed a dedicated account for foundation activities to keep everything separate from our main business finances. He said he'd meant to tell me, but had forgotten in the chaos of running both the agency and the foundation. 3 months ago, I decided to do some basic research on our foundation's status. I went to the IRS website to look up our non-profit registration and couldn't find any record of Ryan and Trevor Marketing Foundation or any variation of that name. I tried different search terms and looked through recently registered non-profits in our state, but nothing matched. I assumed there might be a delay in the database updating, or that the organization was registered under a different name structure. I started asking Trevor more direct questions about the foundation's legal status and financial operations. How much money had we donated in services? Which specific non-profits had we helped? What was our current donor base? Trevor's answers were consistently vague and often contradictory. He'd claimed we'd helped a dozen organizations, but when I pressed for names and project details, he could only provide superficial information about 2 or 3. The real crisis hit 2 months ago when I received a certified letter from the IRS. They were conducting an audit of our business and had questions about charitable deductions we'd claimed related to RTM Foundation over the past 14 months. The letter specifically mentioned that they couldn't find any registered non-profit organization by that name and were concerned about the legitimacy of the deductions we'd taken on our corporate tax returns. I immediately confronted Trevor with the IRS letter. His face went pale when he saw it, and I could tell he knew exactly what it was about without reading it. I asked him directly, was our foundation actually a registered non-profit? Trevor hesitated for a long moment before admitting that he'd never completed the non-profit registration process. He claimed that the paperwork had been more complicated than he'd expected, and that he'd planned to finalize it eventually, but the foundation had grown faster than anticipated, and he'd gotten overwhelmed. But there was more to the story, and it started tumbling out as I pressed him for details. Trevor admitted that he'd been soliciting donations to the foundation from local businesses and wealthy individuals for over a year. The money went into the separate bank account he'd opened, and he'd been using it for personal expenses while claiming it was for foundation operations and charitable activities. I demanded to see the bank statements for the foundation account. Trevor initially refused, claiming privacy concerns, but when I threatened to report him to the police, he finally provided access. What I discovered was devastating. Over the course of 14 months, Trevor had collected nearly $200,000 in donations to our fake foundation. The money had come from dozens of sources: local business owners, wealthy individuals interested in supporting our stated charitable mission, and even a few grants from legitimate foundations that Trevor had somehow secured by misrepresenting our organization's status. The bank statements showed that virtually none of the donated money had gone to actual charitable work. Instead, Trevor had been spending it on personal luxuries, expensive dinners, designer clothing, luxury hotel stays, and even a down payment on a sports car. He'd been living a double life, using our company's reputation and our shared names to run an elaborate fraud while I was completely unaware. When I asked Trevor how he could have done this, his explanation was stunning in its audacity. He said he'd originally planned to set up a legitimate foundation, but had run into complications with the IRS paperwork. Rather than tell me about the problems, he'd decided to move forward with fundraising anyway, thinking he could fix the legal issues later. The donations started coming in faster than he'd expected, and he'd convinced himself that borrowing some of the money for personal use was acceptable because he'd eventually pay it back and get the foundation properly registered. Trevor claimed he'd been planning to come clean about the situation for months, but had been too scared to admit what he'd done. He said he'd gotten in over his head and hadn't known how to extract himself from the lie without destroying our business and facing criminal charges. He actually seemed to believe that his intentions had been good initially and that circumstances had just spiraled out of control beyond his management. I immediately contacted a lawyer who specialized in corporate fraud and non-profit law. She reviewed all the documentation and gave me the harsh reality. Trevor had committed multiple serious crimes, including wire fraud, tax fraud, and possibly money laundering. The fake charity scam had exposed our legitimate business to massive legal liability because Trevor had used our company's name and reputation to solicit donations under false pretenses. Every person and organization that had donated money could potentially sue our company for fraud. The lawyer advised me to cooperate fully with the IRS audit and to provide them with all evidence of Trevor's fraudulent activities. She said, my best chance of protecting myself legally was to demonstrate that I'd been unaware of the fraud and had taken immediate action once I discovered it. I spent the next 2 weeks gathering every document, email, and bank statement related to the fake foundation. During the IRS audit process, investigators discovered additional disturbing details about Trevor's scheme. He'd created fake invoices and project reports to make it look like the foundation was actually providing services to non-profits. He'd even set up email accounts with fake names to communicate as if he were officers of non-existent charitable organizations we'd supposedly helped. The level of planning and deception was far more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. I also learned that Trevor had been inflating our tax deductions by claiming we'd donated far more in professional services than we'd actually provided. He'd valued our supposed charitable work at nearly $300,000 over the past year, which had significantly reduced our company's tax liability. The IRS was now seeking back taxes, penalties, and interest that totaled over $80,000. The personal betrayal was crushing, but the business implications were catastrophic. Several major clients terminated their contracts with us once news of the fraud became public. Our professional reputation, which we'd spent 7 years building, was destroyed almost overnight. Employees started looking for other jobs because they were concerned about the company's stability and didn't want to be associated with the scandal. Trevor's lawyer tried to negotiate some kind of settlement where Trevor would pay restitution and avoid criminal prosecution, but the scope of his fraud made that impossible. The IRS referred the case to federal prosecutors, and Trevor was eventually charged with multiple counts of wire fraud and tax fraud. The total amount of money involved in his scheme exceeded $250,000 when you included the fraudulent donations, inflated tax deductions, and personal expenses he'd charged to the foundation account. I had to make the difficult decision to dissolve our business partnership and essentially start over. I bought out Trevor's share of the company at a heavily discounted price as part of a settlement agreement where he surrendered all his equity in exchange for me not pursuing additional civil claims against him. I had to take out a significant loan to cover the back taxes and legal fees, which put me in debt for the first time in years. The non-profit organizations that had given grants to our fake foundation were understandably furious. Several of them demanded refunds, and I felt morally obligated to repay them even though I wasn't legally required to do so. I used most of my personal savings to return about $40,000 to the legitimate foundations that had been defrauded by Trevor's scheme. Rebuilding the business has been incredibly challenging. I had to rebrand the company under a new name, starting fresh without Trevor and without the reputation we'd built together. I kept 3 of our original employees, who believed in my integrity and were willing to take a chance on the reformed company. Revenue dropped to less than half of what we'd been generating because so many clients left during the scandal. Trevor eventually pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges and was sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. He was also ordered to pay restitution of $200,000 to the victims of his fraud scheme, though it's unlikely he'll ever be able to pay back that amount. His career in marketing is essentially over, and he'll be a convicted felon for the rest of his life. The most painful part of this experience was realizing how completely I'd trusted someone who was systematically defrauding people while using my name and reputation as cover. Trevor hadn't just stolen money, he'd exploited our friendship, our business partnership, and the goodwill we'd built in our professional community. He'd looked me in the eye every day for over a year while running an elaborate criminal scheme that put everything I'd worked for at risk. I've learned that even in a close partnership, there need to be checks and balances that prevent any one person from having completely unmonitored control over financial activities. I'd allowed Trevor to manage certain aspects of our business without oversight because I trusted him and didn't want to micromanage. That trust made it possible for him to operate his fraud scheme for over a year without detection. The experience has also taught me that good intentions can be a cover for terrible behavior. Trevor convinced himself that his charity fraud was somehow acceptable because he'd originally planned to do something good. But the reality is that he stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from people who thought they were supporting worthy causes, and he destroyed a business and a friendship in the process. That's the end of that story. Sometimes the person managing your finances is building their lifestyle on stolen money while you're completely focused on the legitimate work. The fake charity angle was particularly insidious because it made Trevor look virtuous while he was actually running a criminal enterprise. This next story proves that sharing your most prized possessions with someone you live with requires more than just trust and clearly stated boundaries. I'm 32 and my name is Kevin. 2 years ago, I bought a house in a suburb about 30 minutes outside of Portland. The house was perfect, except that it was slightly above my ideal budget, so I decided to rent out the spare bedroom to help cover the mortgage. I work as a software engineer with a fully remote position, which means I'm home most of the day and had concerns about finding a compatible roommate. I've been serious about fitness for about 10 years, and when I bought the house, one of my main priorities was having space for a comprehensive home gym. I converted the oversized 2-car garage into a fully equipped workout space with commercial-grade equipment. Over the course of 3 years, I'd invested roughly $35,000 in building this gym. A power rack, Olympic weights, dumbbells up to 125 pounds, a cable machine, a top-of-the-line treadmill, an assault bike, and various specialty equipment like kettlebells, resistance bands, and a rowing machine. The gym was my pride and joy. I'd researched every piece of equipment carefully, saved up to buy commercial quality gear that would last decades, and organized everything for maximum efficiency and safety. I worked out religiously every morning from 6 to 7:30, and often did additional sessions in the evening. Having this set up at home saved me thousands of dollars in gym membership fees over the years and gave me the flexibility to train whenever I wanted. When I posted an ad for a roommate, I was very specific about the house rules. I mentioned that I had a home gym that was primarily for my personal use, but that a roommate could access it during designated hours with proper respect for the equipment. I wanted someone who understood that this was expensive, carefully maintained gear that needed to be treated appropriately. I interviewed several potential roommates before meeting Marcus. He was 28, worked as a sales representative for a medical device company, and seemed like a clean-cut, responsible person. During the house tour, Marcus was incredibly enthusiastic about the gym setup. He mentioned that he was into fitness and had been looking for a living situation that included workout access. He said he'd been spending about $150 per month on a gym membership and would love to save that money by using my equipment. We discussed the gym usage rules clearly before Marcus moved in. He could use the equipment Monday through Friday from noon to 1 p.m. and after 7 p.m. and on weekends after 9 a.m. He needed to wipe down equipment after use, return weights to their proper places, and immediately report any equipment issues or damage. I emphasized that the equipment was expensive and that proper care was essential. Marcus agreed to all the terms and seemed genuinely respectful of the boundaries I'd set. For the first 3 months, the arrangement worked perfectly. Marcus was a quiet, considerate roommate who paid rent on time and kept common areas clean. I'd occasionally see him using the gym during his allotted times, and he seemed to follow the rules about equipment care and maintenance. He'd often ask me questions about proper form or training techniques, and I was happy to share advice since we had similar fitness interests. Around month 4, I started noticing some small changes in the gym that seemed odd. Equipment would be arranged slightly differently than how I'd left it. Weight plates would be loaded onto bars in combinations I never used. The gym floor mats would be moved around. At first, I attributed this to Marcus, using the space and having a different organizational style. But it started happening even on days when Marcus claimed he hadn't worked out. I also started finding the gym more messy than usual. Sweat marks on equipment that hadn't been wiped down, weights left scattered around instead of racked properly, and water bottles or towels left behind. When I'd mention this to Marcus, he'd apologize and say he'd been rushing to get to work and had forgotten to clean up properly. He'd promised to be more careful, and things would improve for a few days before the problems would start again. About 6 months into our living arrangement, I noticed that my specialty equipment was showing unusual wear patterns. The knurling on my Olympic barbell, which had been sharp and well maintained, was becoming smooth in places. The upholstery on my adjustable bench had scuff marks and small tears. The rubber coating on some of my dumbbells was damaged. This equipment was all high-quality, commercial-grade gear that should have lasted for decades with proper care, but it was showing damage consistent with much heavier use than just 2 people working out. I started paying closer attention to activity in the gym. I work from home with my office on the 2nd floor, and I began noticing sounds coming from the garage at odd hours. I'd hear weights clanking and equipment being moved during times when Marcus should have been at work. When I'd check the garage, it would be empty, but the equipment would be warm and there would be fresh sweat on the mats. 7 months in, I decided to install a basic security camera in the garage. I told myself it was to deter theft since the garage had an exterior door, but really, I was starting to suspect that something unusual was happening with my gym equipment. I installed a simple camera in the corner that would activate on motion and save footage to a cloud service. What I discovered over the next week was shocking. Marcus was bringing strangers into my gym throughout the day while I was supposed to be working upstairs. I'd see him letting people in through the garage's exterior door, sometimes as early as 8 in the morning and as late as 9 at night. These weren't friends stopping by for casual workouts. They were clearly clients participating in structured training sessions. I watched footage of Marcus running people through workout routines, demonstrating exercises, spotting them on heavy lifts, and generally acting as a personal trainer. He'd have different people come in for what appeared to be scheduled 1-hour sessions. Some clients came multiple times per week. Over the course of 1 week, I counted 17 different people using my gym equipment under Marcus's supervision. The footage also revealed why my equipment was deteriorating so rapidly. Marcus's clients were lifting heavy weights with poor form, dropping dumbbells instead of setting them down properly, and generally abusing equipment that I'd spent years carefully maintaining. I watched someone drop my 80-pound dumbbells from shoulder height onto the rubber floor mat, causing visible damage to both the dumbbells and the mat. I saw clients kicking my rowing machine when they got frustrated, and someone actually fell into my cable machine and bent one of the metal support bars. Marcus was running a full-scale personal training business out of my garage gym without my knowledge or permission. He'd been advertising his services online, charging clients for training sessions, and using my $35,000 worth of equipment as his free gym facility. The business appeared to be quite successful. He had a steady stream of clients throughout the week and seemed to be operating a professional operation complete with training plans and progress tracking. I immediately downloaded all the camera footage as evidence and confronted Marcus that same evening. When I showed him the video evidence, he didn't even try to deny what he'd been doing. Instead, he seemed surprised that I was upset about it. He said he'd started training a few friends as a favor, and it had naturally evolved into a side business. He claimed he'd been planning to tell me about it eventually, but wanted to wait until the business was established. Marcus tried to justify his unauthorized business by explaining that he was saving money for a down payment on his own house, and that personal training was a great way to earn extra income. He said he'd been careful with my equipment, and that any damage was just normal wear and tear from use. He actually suggested that I should be grateful because having more people using the gym meant the equipment was getting good value rather than sitting idle most of the day. When I pointed out specific examples of damage from the security footage, Marcus claimed that his clients were all experienced lifters who knew how to handle equipment properly. He blamed the damage on manufacturing defects, or said that my equipment wasn't as high quality as I claimed. He suggested that commercial gyms expect equipment to take heavy use, and that I was being overly precious about gear that was meant to be used hard. I asked Marcus how much money he'd made from his unauthorized personal training business. He was reluctant to answer, but when I told him I'd be reporting the income to the IRS as part of the legal action I was planning, he admitted he'd been charging $75 per session and training about 20 to 25 sessions per week for the past 5 months. That meant he'd earned somewhere between $35,000 and $40,000 using my equipment without my permission or knowledge. The financial implications were staggering. Marcus had essentially stolen the use of my gym facility, which would have cost him thousands of dollars per month to rent commercially. He'd generated tens of thousands of dollars in revenue while paying me only his $800 monthly rent for the bedroom. He'd damaged my equipment through unauthorized commercial use, exposing me to liability if any of his clients had been injured on my property. I immediately told Marcus he had to stop the personal training business immediately and that I wanted him to move out within 30 days. Marcus got defensive and said that kicking him out over a misunderstanding was an overreaction. He offered to pay me $500 per month to continue using the gym for his training business, which he seemed to think was a generous offer. He couldn't understand why I wouldn't want to profit from equipment that was just sitting there anyway. I consulted with a lawyer who specialized in property and business law. She explained that Marcus had been running an unlicensed business from my property without my consent, which violated our rental agreement and potentially exposed me to significant liability. If any of his clients had been injured using my equipment, they could have sued me as the property owner. Marcus also likely didn't have business insurance or personal training liability insurance, which meant the risk was entirely on me. The lawyer helped me document all the equipment damage and estimated the cost of repairs and replacements at roughly $12,000. The Olympic barbell needed to be replaced because the knurling was ruined. The adjustable bench needed reupholstering. Multiple dumbbells had damaged rubber coating that affected their balance and safety. The cable machine's bent support bar was a structural issue that made the entire unit unsafe to use. Various smaller items needed replacement, and the rubber floor mats had permanent damage from dropped weights. I also learned that Marcus had been violating numerous regulations by running an unlicensed personal training business. He wasn't certified as a personal trainer, didn't have a business license, wasn't collecting or paying taxes on his income, and didn't carry any liability insurance. He was essentially operating an illegal business that put both his clients and me at significant risk. When I presented Marcus with the documentation of damages and the lawyer's demand letter, he became angry and accusatory. He claimed I was trying to extort money from him and that the equipment damage was my fault for buying inferior products. He said he'd provided a valuable service to his clients and that I was being vindictive by threatening legal action over a minor disagreement. Marcus refused to pay for any of the equipment damage and said he'd fight any attempt to collect money from him. He moved out 2 weeks later, leaving the bedroom in poor condition and taking some of my gym equipment with him. A complete set of resistance bands, worth about $300, 2 kettlebells, and several smaller accessories. He also left trash and personal items scattered throughout the garage gym that I had to clean up and dispose of. I had to pursue legal action through small claims court to try to recover the cost of the equipment damage. I presented the security camera footage, documentation of the damage, repair estimates from equipment suppliers, and testimony about Marcus's unauthorized business operation. The judge ruled in my favor and awarded me $9,500 in damages, which was less than the actual cost of repairs, but the maximum allowed in our state's small claims court system. Actually collecting the judgment has been nearly impossible. Marcus quit his job shortly after moving out and seems to have disappeared. I've been unable to locate him to enforce the judgment, and the debt collection agency I hired has had no success finding assets to seize or wages to garnish. It's been over a year since the judgment, and I've collected exactly $0. I had to spend $12,000 of my own money to repair and replace the damaged equipment. I also invested another $2,000 in security upgrades, including better locks on the garage exterior door, a more sophisticated camera system, and signs clearly stating that the space is private property not open to the public. I'm still discovering small items of equipment that Marcus apparently took or that were damaged during his training sessions. The experience completely soured me on having roommates. The few $100s per month I was earning in rent wasn't worth the risk of having someone exploit my property and equipment for their personal gain. I now live alone and cover the full mortgage payment myself, which is financially tighter but gives me peace of mind that nobody is running an unauthorized business out of my house. I also learned that you can't assume people will respect your property just because you've clearly communicated boundaries and rules. Marcus understood exactly what he was doing wrong. He just didn't care because he was profiting from the arrangement and thought he could get away with it. The fact that he felt entitled to use my equipment for his business and seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset showed a level of audacity that still amazes me. That's the end of that story. Installing that security camera saved me from even more damage and gave me the evidence I needed for court, but I still lost thousands of dollars and months of time dealing with the aftermath. Sometimes people see your resources as their opportunity to profit, and they'll completely disregard your property rights to make money. This story is particularly disturbing because it involves the very person you hire to protect you during one of the most vulnerable times in your life, and it shows how the adversarial system itself can be corrupted from within. I'm 41, and my name is Jason. 18 months ago, my wife of 12 years, Christina, told me she wanted a divorce. It wasn't a complete surprise. We'd been having serious problems for about 2 years, mainly around financial stress and different parenting philosophies for our 2 kids. Christina had become increasingly distant, and we'd tried marriage counseling for about 6 months without making meaningful progress. When she said she wanted to end the marriage, I was sad but understood that we'd grown apart. We agreed to try to keep the divorce as civil as possible for the sake of our kids, who were 9 and 7 at the time. We had significant assets to divide. Our house, worth about $600,000, with a mortgage of $200,000 remaining, retirement accounts totaling around $400,000, and various other investments and savings. We also had to work out custody arrangements and child support. Christina filed for divorce first and hired an attorney named Mitchell Berman from a well-known family law firm in our city. I asked friends for referrals and was repeatedly recommended to contact David Steinberg, who had a reputation as an aggressive but fair divorce attorney. Several people told me that David had helped them get favorable settlements and that he was worth his rate of $350 per hour. I met with David for an initial consultation that lasted about 90 minutes. He asked detailed questions about our marriage, our assets, my income, and what I hoped to achieve through the divorce. I told him I wanted shared custody of the kids, a fair division of assets, and to keep the process as quick and inexpensive as possible. David seemed confident that we could achieve those goals, and said that most divorces settle within 6 to 9 months unless there are unusual complications. David explained his billing structure very clearly. He charged $350 per hour for his time, with his paralegal billing at $125 per hour. He estimated that a relatively straightforward divorce like mine should cost between $15,000 and $25,000 in legal fees, assuming we could reach a settlement without going to trial. He said that divorces that went to trial could easily cost $50,000 or more per side, which was why settlement was almost always preferable. I hired David and paid a retainer of $10,000 to get started. He seemed knowledgeable and professional, and I felt confident that I'd made a good choice. The first few months of the divorce process moved reasonably quickly. David filed responses to Christina's initial petition, and we began the discovery process of documenting all our assets and debts. This seemed standard and appropriate, based on what I'd read about divorce procedures. However, around month 4, I started noticing that the process was becoming more complicated than David had initially suggested. Simple questions that seemed like they should be resolved with a quick email exchange would turn into lengthy back-and-forth communications between the attorneys. Scheduling meetings with Christina and both attorneys for settlement discussions became incredibly difficult, with multiple proposed dates falling through due to scheduling conflicts. David started requesting more and more documentation from me. He'd ask for bank statements, credit card records, and financial documents covering many years. Some of these requests made sense, but others seemed excessive for a marriage where both parties agreed on the general outline of our assets. When I'd ask why we needed 5 years of credit card statements for an account that had been closed for 3 years, David would explain that we needed comprehensive documentation to ensure nothing was missed in the settlement. I began receiving monthly billing statements from David's firm that were much higher than I'd anticipated. In month 5, I was billed for 21 hours of attorney time and 14 hours of paralegal time, totaling over $9,000 for that single month. The itemized bill included charges for things like review email from opposing counsel at 0.3 hours, telephone conference with client at 0.5 hours for a conversation I remembered lasting maybe 10 minutes, and research case law regarding asset division at 3.5 hours. When I questioned some of these charges, David assured me that everything was necessary and appropriate for my case. He said that divorce litigation was expensive and that these hours were typical for cases at our stage. He emphasized that he was fighting hard for my interests and that cutting corners on preparation would hurt my settlement outcome. Month 6 brought even higher bills. I was charged for over 30 hours of attorney time that month, including 8.5 hours for preparation of settlement proposal and 6 hours for a settlement meeting that I knew had lasted only 2 hours. The total bill for that month was almost $12,000. My retainer was long depleted, and I'd already paid David's firm nearly $35,000 total. The settlement proposals being exchanged between David and Christina's attorney seemed designed to be unacceptable to both parties. David would propose that I keep 80% of the retirement assets, which he knew Christina would never accept. Christina's attorney would counter with a proposal giving her 75% of the home equity, which was equally unrealistic. Neither attorney seemed interested in finding middle ground or proposing reasonable compromises that might actually lead to settlement. I started to feel like I was trapped in an endless cycle of proposals, counter-proposals, and additional discovery requests that were generating massive legal bills without moving us closer to resolution. Simple issues that Christina and I had already agreed on verbally, like the custody schedule, were being complicated with additional legal maneuvering and documentation requirements. 8 months into the divorce process, I'd paid David's firm over $50,000, which was already double the high end of his initial estimate. We still didn't have a settlement agreement, and David was now suggesting that we might need to go to trial because Christina's attorney was being unreasonable. He said that trial could cost an additional $30,000 to $40,000, but might be necessary to protect my interests. I started doing my own research on divorce procedures and timelines in our state. I discovered that the average contested divorce in our area took about 12 to 14 months from filing to final judgment, and the median cost per party was around $25,000. We were already well past those averages on both time and cost, with no end in sight. That's when I started becoming suspicious about whether David was really acting in my best interests. I requested copies of all communications between David and Christina's attorney, Mitchell. I spent a weekend reading through hundreds of pages of emails and letters between the two lawyers. What I found made my stomach drop. The communication between David and Mitchell was far friendlier and more collaborative than I'd expected. They'd joke with each other, make references to socializing together, and generally seem to have a warm professional relationship. That wasn't necessarily problematic on its own, but the content of their case discussions started revealing a concerning pattern. In one email exchange, Mitchell proposed a settlement framework that seemed quite reasonable and close to what Christina and I had originally discussed wanting. David's response was to reject it outright and propose something much more extreme. But in a later email to me, David had characterized Mitchell's proposal as completely unreasonable and far outside the norm for our situation, which wasn't what the actual proposal had said. In another exchange, David and Mitchell were discussing scheduling for a settlement conference. Mitchell suggested several dates over a 2-week period, but David claimed in his response that he was unavailable for all of those dates due to trial commitments. However, I'd been copied on David's calendar invitations during that same period, and he'd been scheduling depositions and client meetings, not trials. He'd deliberately created a scheduling conflict that delayed our settlement conference by 6 weeks. I found multiple instances where the attorneys seemed to be artificially prolonging disputes over minor issues. There was a 3-week email exchange about the valuation date for our retirement accounts that involved over 30 emails back and forth. The two attorneys were debating technical legal points that seemed designed to create billable work rather than resolve the issue. In the end, they agreed on a valuation date that was exactly what I'd proposed to David in the first place. The most damning evidence came when I found an email where Mitchell had sent David a settlement proposal that he described as Christina's bottom line position. She'll accept this if Jason agrees. The proposal was actually quite reasonable and close to what I would have accepted, but David never forwarded that email to me. Instead, he sent me a different summary of Mitchell's proposal that made it sound far more one-sided and unacceptable than the actual terms. I realized that David and Mitchell had been colluding to drag out the divorce process and maximize their billable hours. They were creating unnecessary complications, rejecting reasonable settlement proposals, and generally working together to ensure that both parties spent as much money as possible on legal fees. They were both billing their respective clients hundreds of dollars per hour for communications with each other that were designed to prolong the case rather than resolve it. I did more research and discovered that David and Mitchell had worked on multiple cases together over the years, always on opposite sides. They seemed to frequently represent divorcing couples in the same social and professional circles. I found online reviews from other clients who'd complained about unexpectedly high legal bills in cases handled by either David or Mitchell. I confronted David with the evidence I'd found, including the specific email where Mitchell had sent a settlement proposal that David had never shown me. David initially tried to claim that he'd used professional judgment in determining what to present to me and what to handle himself. He said that attorneys are supposed to filter communications and provide strategic guidance, not just forward every email from opposing counsel. But when I pressed him on the specific cases where he deliberately mischaracterized proposals or created artificial delays, David became defensive and angry. He accused me of not understanding how divorce litigation works and suggested that I was being paranoid and ungrateful after all the work he'd done on my case. He claimed that everything he'd done was standard practice and that I was second-guessing strategy decisions that were made for my benefit. I immediately fired David and reported him to the State Bar Association for ethical violations. I hired a new attorney, specifically asking for someone who didn't regularly work with Mitchell, and showed her all the evidence I'd gathered. My new attorney was appalled by what she saw and confirmed that the billing patterns and case handling were highly irregular and likely violated professional conduct rules. With my new attorney, we were able to reach a settlement agreement with Christina within 6 weeks. The terms were almost identical to what Mitchell had proposed in that email 9 months earlier, the one that David had never shown me. Christina was relieved to finally settle, and she later told me that she'd also been frustrated with how long the process was taking and how expensive Mitchell's bills had become. I calculated that David's deliberate delays and unnecessary complications had cost me approximately $45,000 in excess legal fees. Christina had paid similar amounts to Mitchell. Together, we'd spent nearly $90,000 more than necessary, because our attorneys had been colluding to drag out the case. The State Bar investigation into David's conduct took over a year. They found that he'd violated multiple professional conduct rules related to client communication, fee arrangements, and zealous representation. He received a formal reprimand and was required to complete ethics training, but he kept his license to practice law. Mitchell received similar discipline. I tried to sue David for legal malpractice to recover some of the excess fees I'd paid. However, the malpractice attorney I consulted explained that these cases are very difficult to win because you have to prove that David's misconduct directly caused you to receive a worse outcome in the divorce. Since my final settlement was reasonable and close to what I would have expected, I couldn't demonstrate financial harm beyond the excess legal fees themselves, and those damages weren't sufficient to make a malpractice case economically viable. I never recovered any of the money I'd unnecessarily spent on David's inflated legal bills. Christina and I both ended up with less money from our marital assets than we should have because so much of it went to attorneys' fees. The house sale proceeds that should have been split between us were partially consumed by legal costs. My retirement savings, which I'd spent 20 years building, were significantly depleted to pay for a divorce that should have cost a fraction of what I actually paid. The experience taught me that the adversarial nature of divorce litigation creates perverse incentives for attorneys to prolong cases and maximize billable hours. The clients on both sides suffer while the attorneys profit from the conflict. David and Mitchell had found a lucrative arrangement where they could both bill hundreds of hours by creating artificial complexity and rejecting reasonable settlement proposals. I've since learned that this kind of attorney collusion is more common than most people realize, though it's difficult to prove and rarely results in serious professional consequences. Attorneys in close-knit legal communities work together on multiple cases over the years, and some develop arrangements where they protect each other's billing interests rather than their clients' interests. That's the end of that story. The attorney I trusted to protect my interests during one of the most difficult periods of my life was actively working against me to maximize his fees. The financial and emotional cost of David's betrayal extended a painful process by months and drained resources that should have gone to supporting my children and rebuilding my life after divorce. Our next story shows what can happen when you invest time and knowledge into someone's career development while giving them access to everything you've built over years of hard work. My junior colleague has been poaching my clients and contacts for 2 years while I was training him to take over my accounts when I moved into management. I'm 39 years old and my name is Daniel. I've worked in commercial real estate for the past 15 years, specializing in office space leasing in downtown Seattle. Over that time, I'd built an extensive network of property owners, developers, and corporate clients who trusted me to handle their leasing needs. My commission-based income had grown steadily, and last year I earned about $270,000, which was well above the industry average for my market. 2 years ago, my firm promoted me to a senior partner position that would transition me from direct client work into more of a management and business development role. The promotion came with a significant salary increase and equity stake in the firm, but it also meant gradually handing off my existing client relationships to other agents. I was excited about the new opportunity, but also nervous about ensuring my clients would be well cared for during the transition. The firm assigned a 29-year-old agent named Brad to work under me as my junior partner. Brad had been with the company for about 3 years and had shown promise, though his sales numbers were modest compared to the top performers. Management thought that pairing him with me would give him the mentorship and client exposure he needed to develop into a senior agent. The plan was for Brad to shadow me for 6 months, then gradually take over my client accounts as I moved into my new management responsibilities. Brad seemed like the perfect mentee when we first started working together. He was enthusiastic, asked thoughtful questions, and appeared genuinely grateful for the opportunity to learn from someone with my experience and client base. He'd take detailed notes during client meetings, follow up on action items promptly, and regularly asked for my feedback on his approach and communication style. I spent considerable time teaching Brad the nuances of the commercial real estate business. I introduced him to my contacts at major corporations, property management firms, and development companies. I brought him to networking events, industry conferences, and client dinners where I'd spent years building relationships. I shared my strategies for identifying client needs, structuring deals, and maintaining long-term relationships that generated repeat business. For the first 6 months, everything seemed to be progressing well. Brad was learning quickly, and clients responded positively to him. Several of my long-term clients specifically mentioned that they appreciated having Brad as a backup contact and felt confident that their needs would continue to be met as I transitioned to my new role. I was proud of how smoothly the succession planning was going. Around month 7, I started noticing some small irregularities in how Brad was handling client communications. I'd find out about meetings he'd scheduled with my clients without telling me in advance. When I'd ask about these meetings, Brad would say they'd been last-minute requests from clients and he hadn't wanted to bother me with minor issues since I was busy with my new management responsibilities. His explanations seemed reasonable, so I didn't think much of it initially. I also noticed that Brad had become less communicative about client activities and deal progress. Early in our partnership, he'd send me detailed summaries after every client interaction and ask for my input on strategy, but as time went on, his updates became less frequent and more vague. When I'd ask specific questions about particular clients or deals, Brad would give general responses that didn't include much detail. About 10 months into our working relationship, one of my oldest clients, a property management company I'd worked with for 8 years, called me directly with a complaint. They said that Brad had been pushing them to sign an exclusive representation agreement that would lock them into working only with him for all their leasing needs. The client was uncomfortable with this, because they valued their relationship with me and didn't want to be obligated to work exclusively with Brad, whom they'd only known for a few months. When I asked Brad about the exclusive agreement, he claimed it was a misunderstanding. He said he'd been following the firm's new policies about formalizing client relationships and hadn't realized the client would interpret it as excluding me from their account. He apologized and said he'd clear up the confusion immediately, but the incident made me start paying closer attention to Brad's activities with my other clients. Over the next few weeks, I discovered that Brad had been systematically approaching my clients with similar exclusive representation agreements. He'd been positioning these agreements as standard industry practice and administrative updates to our working relationship. But the agreements would have essentially transferred my client relationships to Brad entirely, cutting me out of any future commissions or involvement with accounts I'd spent years developing. I started reviewing email communications between Brad and my clients more carefully. What I found was disturbing. Brad had been subtly undermining my reputation and positioning himself as the more responsive, available, and capable agent. He'd make comments to clients like, "I know Daniel is very busy with his new management role, so I wanted to make sure you had someone dedicated to your account," or, "Since Daniel is transitioning away from client work, I'll be your primary point of contact going forward." These statements weren't technically false, but they were misleading. My transition to management was supposed to be gradual, and I'd explicitly told clients that I'd remain involved in their accounts during the handoff period and would always be available for strategic guidance. Brad was accelerating the transition without my knowledge and making it seem like I was abandoning clients rather than carefully managing a succession plan. I also discovered that Brad had been reaching out to contacts in my network who weren't even current clients. He'd been introducing himself as my business partner and successor, asking for meetings to discuss their real estate needs. Several of these contacts called me confused about why Brad was contacting them, since they'd had no prior relationship with him and weren't actively looking for leasing services. The most shocking discovery came when I learned that Brad had been meeting with some of my clients' competitors without telling me. He'd been using the market knowledge and client intelligence I'd shared with him to pursue business with companies that directly competed with my existing clients. This was not only unethical, but potentially violated confidentiality obligations we had to our clients. 1 year into our partnership, I confronted Brad with all the evidence I'd gathered. I showed him the exclusive representation agreements, the email communications where he'd undermined me, and documentation of his outreach to my network contacts without authorization. Brad's initial response was to act shocked and hurt that I'd question his motives. He claimed that everything he'd done was in good faith and aimed at building the business. But as I pressed him on specific instances of misrepresentation and unauthorized client contact, Brad's story started to change. He admitted that he'd been more aggressive than necessary in trying to secure client relationships, but said he'd felt pressure to prove himself and generate his own book of business. He claimed that the firm's commission structure incentivized him to convert my client relationships into his own accounts as quickly as possible, and that he'd been following what he thought were normal business development practices. When I asked Brad about using confidential client information to pursue their competitors, he became defensive. He said that market knowledge wasn't confidential and that he had every right to pursue any potential clients in our market. He suggested that I was being territorial and protective of information that should be shared within our firm to maximize business development opportunities. I reported Brad's conduct to our firm's managing partners and provided them with all the documentation I'd gathered. They conducted an investigation that revealed even more troubling behavior. Brad had been keeping a separate database of my client contacts and deal information that he'd been planning to take with him if he left the firm. He'd been copying my client files, email correspondence, and strategic documents to his personal cloud storage account. The investigation also revealed that Brad had been actively interviewing with competing real estate firms while still working under me. He'd been using his access to my client relationships and market knowledge as leverage to negotiate positions at other companies, essentially planning to steal my book of business and take it to a competitor. Several firms had expressed interest in hiring Brad specifically because of his claimed relationships with my high-value clients. Most disturbing was the discovery that Brad had been bad-mouthing me to clients and industry contacts for months. He'd been suggesting that my move to management meant I was being pushed out of client work due to performance issues, that I was losing touch with the market, and that clients would be better served by working directly with him instead. He'd been systematically destroying my professional reputation while building his own at my expense. The firm terminated Brad immediately for violating confidentiality agreements, misrepresenting client relationships, and planning to steal proprietary business information. However, the damage to my client relationships was significant. Several clients had signed exclusive agreements with Brad before his termination, and those contracts were legally binding, even though they'd been obtained through misrepresentation. The firm's legal team had to negotiate releases from those agreements, which was time-consuming and damaged client trust. I also discovered that some of my long-term clients had become genuinely confused about whether they should continue working with me or wait to see where Brad ended up. He'd been so effective in positioning himself as the primary relationship manager that some clients actually thought of him as their main contact rather than me, despite our much longer history. The financial impact was substantial. I lost out on approximately $80,000 in commissions from deals that Brad had claimed credit for or that fell through during the chaos of his termination and the subsequent client relationship cleanup. Several clients decided to work with entirely different firms because they were frustrated with the situation and felt like they'd been caught in the middle of an internal company dispute. My transition to the management role was significantly disrupted because I had to spend months rebuilding client relationships and re-establishing myself as the primary contact for accounts that should have remained mine throughout the price. Succession planning process. Instead of gradually moving into strategic and business development work, I was forced back into day-to-day client management to repair the damage Brad had caused. The firm eventually hired a different junior agent to work with me on client transitions, but the process was much slower and more cautious the second time around. I implemented strict protocols about client communications, required that I be copied on all client correspondence, and maintained much tighter control over access to client information and strategic documents. The mentorship relationship was far less open and collaborative because I couldn't risk another situation where my protégé would exploit my trust and generosity. Brad found another position at a competing firm within 2 months of his termination. He'd apparently convinced that firm that his termination was due to personality conflicts rather than ethical violations, and they hired him based on his claimed relationships with clients who were actually my contacts. Several of those clients were confused when Brad reached out to them from his new firm, and a few reported his contact to me because they felt uncomfortable with his aggressive pursuit. I've spent the past year rebuilding my professional reputation and client relationships that Brad damaged during our 2 years working together. The experience taught me that mentorship and knowledge sharing need to be balanced with appropriate safeguards and oversight. I'd been so focused on being a generous mentor and helping Brad succeed that I'd given him unrestricted access to my most valuable professional assets, my client relationships and market knowledge. That's the end of that story. The person I was training to eventually take over my accounts was actually planning to steal them much sooner and take them to a competitor. Brad saw my generosity and mentorship as an opportunity to accelerate his career at my expense, and he was willing to destroy my professional relationships to do it. This next story demonstrates how the people who appear most devoted to helping us through health crises can sometimes have very different motivations than we realize, and how medical conditions can be weaponized for control and financial gain. I'm 34, and my name is Michael. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, a chronic inflammatory bowel condition that requires careful management through medication, diet, and stress reduction. The diagnosis was difficult to accept, but with proper treatment, my gastroenterologist assured me that most people with Crohn's live normal, active lives. The key is consistent medication adherence and avoiding trigger foods that can cause flare-ups. I'd been dating my girlfriend Sarah for about 8 months when I received my diagnosis. She was incredibly supportive during that difficult time, attending doctor appointments with me, researching the condition, and helping me adjust to the dietary restrictions and medication schedule. Her support meant everything to me during those early months when I was learning to manage a lifelong chronic illness. About 6 months after my diagnosis, Sarah suggested that she move into my condo to help me manage my condition more effectively. She argued that having someone there to help with meal planning, medication reminders, and monitoring symptoms would improve my health outcomes. I was hesitant because we'd only been dating for about 14 months total, but Sarah insisted that my health had to be the priority. She said she wanted to support me through this challenge, and that living together would make caregiving much easier. Sarah moved in and immediately took charge of managing my Crohn's disease treatment plan. She organized my medications, prepared all my meals according to what she said were Crohn's-friendly recipes, and kept detailed logs of my symptoms and bathroom habits. At first, I appreciated her involvement and attention to detail. Managing a chronic illness is exhausting, and having someone help with the daily tasks felt like a relief. However, about 3 months after Sarah moved in, I started experiencing more frequent flare-ups of my Crohn's symptoms. I'd have severe abdominal pain, urgent bathroom needs, and fatigue that made it difficult to work or maintain normal activities. These flare-ups were happening every few weeks, which was much more frequent than my gastroenterologist had predicted given my treatment plan. Sarah was extremely attentive during these flare-ups, taking care of me, calling in sick to work on my behalf, and managing communications with my family about my health status. She'd tell my parents and siblings that I was having a difficult time managing my condition and that she was the only person I felt comfortable having around during these episodes. My family was grateful that Sarah was there to take care of me and started to rely on her for updates about my health. I mentioned the increased flare-ups to my gastroenterologist during a follow-up appointment. He was surprised because my medication levels looked appropriate and my test results suggested the disease should be well controlled. He asked detailed questions about my diet and stress levels. I told him that Sarah was managing my meal planning and that I was following what she said was a Crohn's-friendly diet strictly. The doctor asked me to keep a detailed food diary for 2 weeks and bring it to my next appointment. Sarah offered to maintain the diary for me since she was preparing all my meals anyway. She assured me she'd document everything accurately so the doctor could identify any potential trigger foods. Over the next several months, my condition seemed to deteriorate further. I was having flare-ups every week or two, losing weight and feeling constantly fatigued. I had to take significant time off work, and my employer was becoming concerned about my frequent absences. Sarah suggested that I consider going on short-term disability because my health was clearly too unstable for regular employment. Around this same time, Sarah began suggesting that I needed help managing my finances and medical decisions. She said that during my worst flare-ups, I wasn't capable of making clear-headed decisions, and that I needed someone who could make medical and financial choices on my behalf if I became incapacitated. She pushed me to grant her power of attorney for both healthcare and financial matters. I was resistant to this idea initially, but Sarah framed it as a practical necessity given my deteriorating health. She pointed out that I'd been unable to work consistently, had missed important medical appointments due to symptoms, and sometimes couldn't even make it to the pharmacy to pick up prescriptions during bad flare-ups. She said that having legal authority to act on my behalf would ensure I received proper care, even when I was too sick to manage things myself. Sarah also began talking to my family about her concerns regarding my ability to manage my own affairs. She'd call my mother and describe episodes where I was supposedly confused, forgetful, or making poor decisions due to pain and medication side effects. My family became increasingly worried and actually began encouraging me to grant Sarah the power of attorney, thinking it was necessary to protect me during my health crisis. Under pressure from both Sarah and my concerned family, I eventually signed power of attorney documents, giving Sarah authority over my healthcare and financial decisions. The attorney who drafted the documents asked me several times if I was sure about this decision and whether I understood the scope of authority I was granting. I assured him that I trusted Sarah completely and that this was necessary given my chronic health condition. Almost immediately after obtaining power of attorney, Sarah began making changes to my healthcare and financial arrangements. She switched my primary care physician to a doctor she'd researched, claiming my current doctor wasn't specialized enough in Crohn's disease. She took over all communications with my gastroenterologist, often attending appointments without me and reporting back about what the doctor had said. Sarah also began managing my bank accounts and credit cards directly. She said this was necessary to ensure my medical bills were paid on time and that I wasn't making impulsive purchases that could affect my ability to afford treatment. She set up a system where I had to ask her permission to spend money beyond a small weekly allowance she provided. My health continued to decline over the following months. I was having near constant symptoms and felt sicker than I had since my initial diagnosis. My new primary care doctor, selected by Sarah, seemed primarily focused on managing my symptoms with additional medications rather than investigating why the Crohn's disease wasn't responding to treatment as expected. The turning point came about 8 months after Sarah obtained power of attorney. My sister Emily came to visit me unexpectedly on a weekday afternoon when Sarah was at work. Emily brought lunch from my favorite restaurant, including a sandwich that contained ingredients I'd supposedly been avoiding due to my Crohn's diet restrictions. I was hesitant to eat it, explaining that Sarah had told me those ingredients were major trigger foods that would cause a severe flare-up. Emily was confused because she'd done her own research on Crohn's disease and knew that the ingredients in question, things like plain grilled chicken and white rice, were actually considered safe and well tolerated for most Crohn's patients. Emily insisted that I eat the sandwich and see what happened. To my surprise, I felt fine afterward. No abdominal pain, no urgent bathroom needs, none of the symptoms that Sarah had told me would result from eating these foods. Emily and I started to wonder whether the dietary restrictions Sarah had been enforcing were actually necessary or based on accurate information about Crohn's disease. Over the next week, while Sarah was away on a work trip, Emily stayed with me and we experimented with my diet. We reintroduced numerous foods that Sarah had banned, and I felt better than I had in over a year. My energy improved, I had fewer bathroom urgencies, and the constant abdominal pain that had become my normal state began to decrease significantly. Emily and I started investigating Sarah's management of my Crohn's treatment more carefully. We reviewed my medication bottles and discovered that several of my prescriptions were actually not the medications my gastroenterologist had prescribed. Sarah had been filling different prescriptions at a pharmacy across town and giving me those pills instead of my actual Crohn's medications. We found bottles of laxatives hidden in Sarah's closet, along with various supplements and substances that could cause gastrointestinal symptoms. Emily helped me piece together what had been happening. Sarah had been deliberately sabotaging my Crohn's disease management. She was giving me the wrong medications, putting substances in my food that caused symptoms similar to Crohn's flare-ups, and enforcing unnecessary dietary restrictions that actually made my nutrition worse. I checked my bank accounts and discovered that Sarah had been systematically draining my savings. She'd made numerous large purchases for herself, transferred money to accounts I didn't recognize, and taken out a credit card in my name that had been maxed out on her personal expenses. Over the 8 months she'd had financial power of attorney, she'd spent or transferred approximately $45,000 of my money. I also found email correspondence between Sarah and my original gastroenterologist, where he'd expressed concern about my declining health despite appropriate treatment. Sarah had responded to these emails, claiming that I was non-compliant with medications and diet, and asking the doctor to write letters documenting my inability to manage my own healthcare. She'd been using these letters to justify her power of attorney and to convince my family that I was incapable of taking care of myself. When Sarah returned from her work trip, I confronted her with everything Emily and I had discovered. Sarah initially denied everything and claimed that I was confused and that my illness was affecting my judgment. But when I showed her the evidence of the wrong medications, the hidden laxatives, and the bank statements showing her unauthorized spending, she couldn't maintain her denials. Sarah's justification for her behavior was stunning in its selfishness and lack of remorse. She said she'd been working hard to take care of me and deserved compensation for her caregiving efforts. She claimed that my money was essentially joint property since she'd been supporting me through my illness. She argued that she'd only been making me sick enough to qualify for disability benefits so I'd have a stable income, and that this was actually helping me in the long run. I immediately contacted a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse and disability exploitation. Even though I wasn't elderly, the attorney explained that the same legal protections apply to adults with disabilities who've been exploited by caregivers. The lawyer helped me revoke Sarah's power of attorney immediately and freeze my bank accounts to prevent further theft. I also filed a police report documenting Sarah's theft, fraud, and what the police described as possible attempted poisoning or assault for deliberately making me sick. The investigation revealed that Sarah had a history of similar behavior with previous partners. She'd been fired from a home healthcare job years earlier amid allegations that she'd been stealing from an elderly patient, though charges were never filed in that case. I had to get a restraining order against Sarah because she became aggressive and threatening when she realized the full legal consequences she was facing. She alternated between claiming she'd done nothing wrong and trying to convince me that I was too sick to manage without her help. She even contacted my family trying to convince them that I was having a mental breakdown and that they should intervene to restore her authority over my care. Fortunately, Emily had documented everything we'd discovered, and my family quickly understood that Sarah had been manipulating all of us. They were horrified to realize that their encouragement for me to grant Sarah power of attorney had been based on false information Sarah had fed them about my capabilities and health status. With proper medical management and actual Crohn's-appropriate treatment, my health improved dramatically within weeks. My gastroenterologist was appalled when he learned what Sarah had been doing and provided detailed documentation for the criminal investigation. He confirmed that my Crohn's disease should have been well controlled with proper medication, and that the severe symptoms I'd been experiencing were consistent with deliberate sabotage. Sarah was eventually charged with multiple felonies, including theft, fraud, and assault. The prosecutor argued that deliberately making someone sick for financial gain constituted assault under our state's laws. Sarah pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 2 years in prison followed by probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution of $45,000, though I doubt I'll ever recover that money. The experience left me with severe trust issues and anxiety about accepting help from others. I'd allowed someone into the most vulnerable aspects of my life, my health, and finances, and she'd exploited that access to nearly destroy me. If Emily hadn't visited unexpectedly and insisted on experimenting with my diet, Sarah's scheme might have continued for years. I've since learned that caregiver exploitation of people with chronic illnesses or disabilities is far more common than most people realize. Perpetrators often isolate their victims, control information flow to family members, and use the victim's medical condition as justification for taking control over their lives. Sarah had executed a textbook exploitation scheme, and I'd been too sick and trusting to recognize what was happening. That's the end of that story. The person who was supposed to be helping me manage my chronic illness was actually making me sicker to justify controlling my life and stealing my money. Sarah weaponized my medical condition against me and convinced everyone around me that I was incapable of taking care of myself. This story is deeply troubling because it shows how family members can exploit your success and generosity, turning your financial help into an elaborate scheme that puts your entire financial future at risk. My brother has been using my identity and credit to fund his lifestyle for 3 years, and my parents knew about it but didn't tell me because they didn't want me to stop helping the family. I'm 29 and my name is Jennifer. I work as a software developer for a major tech company in San Francisco, earning about $160,000 per year. I've always been financially responsible, saving aggressively and maintaining excellent credit. My younger brother Tyler, who's 25, has struggled more with finding career direction and financial stability. He's bounced between jobs and has always been what my parents call the creative one, who needs more support and understanding. My parents are both retired school teachers, living in Sacramento on modest pensions. They've always emphasized family loyalty and helping each other through difficulties. Growing up, I was often told that as the more academically successful child, I'd need to help support Tyler when I was established in my career. I accepted this as normal family responsibility and never questioned the expectation that I'd financially support my brother to some extent. 3 years ago, Tyler was going through a particularly difficult period. He'd dropped out of community college, was working part-time at a coffee shop, and was living at home with our parents. He seemed depressed and directionless, which worried all of us. During a family dinner, Tyler mentioned that he'd been trying to get an apartment and start fresh, but his credit score was too low to qualify for a lease on his own. I offered to co-sign a lease for Tyler to help him get started. My parents were enthusiastic about this idea and said it would be exactly the support Tyler needed to get his life on track. I agreed to co-sign for an apartment with rent of $1,400 per month, with the understanding that Tyler would pay the rent himself from his job earnings. I'd simply be the backup guarantor to get him approved. Tyler moved into his apartment and seemed to be doing better. He got a new job at a marketing startup and appeared to be taking more responsibility for his life. I felt good about helping my brother get established and thought that co-signing the lease had been the right decision. About 6 months later, my parents called asking if I could help Tyler with some unexpected medical bills. They said he'd had a dental emergency that cost about $3,000 and didn't have insurance coverage. They asked if I could loan Tyler the money, with the understanding that he'd pay me back gradually. I sent him the money immediately because I knew dental problems could be serious and didn't want my brother suffering. Over the next 2 years, there was a steady stream of requests for financial help for Tyler. My parents would call saying Tyler needed money for car repairs, medical expenses, professional development courses, or temporary shortfalls in rent money. I sent money dozens of times, usually between $500 and $3,000 per request. I kept a mental tally and figured I'd given Tyler about $35,000 over that period, which I considered loans that he'd eventually repay once his career was more established. I never pushed Tyler for repayment, because my parents emphasized that he was doing his best and that family was supposed to help each other without keeping strict accounting. They'd remind me how much more fortunate I was in my career and income, and suggest that I should be grateful I was in a position to help rather than resentful about the money. About 8 months ago, I received a letter from a collections agency claiming I owed $12,000 for a defaulted personal loan. I was completely confused because I'd never taken out a personal loan. I assumed it was a case of identity theft and immediately called the collections agency to dispute the debt. The collections representative provided details about the loan. It had been taken out 2 years earlier from an online lending company, supposedly by me, with my social security number and identifying information. The loan had been paid on for about 6 months before payment stopped, and it had now gone into default. They had my correct address and contact information, which was unusual for identity theft cases. I requested detailed documentation of the loan application and payment history. When I received the paperwork, I was shocked to recognize Tyler's email address as the contact email on the loan account. The mailing address was his apartment, the one I'd co-signed for. The loan payments had initially been made from a bank account I didn't recognize, but the account was in my name at a bank I'd never done business with. I immediately pulled my credit report for the first time in over a year. What I discovered was devastating. There were 7 different credit accounts I'd never opened. 3 credit cards with combined balances of $28,000. 2 personal loans totaling $35,000. And 2 retail store credit cards with balances of $6,000. All of the accounts had been opened over the past 2.5 years using my personal information. The mailing addresses on these accounts were a mix of Tyler's apartment and a P.O. box I'd never heard of. Many of the accounts were in default or severely past due, and my credit score had plummeted from 790 to 540. I had nearly $70,000 in fraudulent debt attached to my identity, and it was destroying my credit rating. I contacted the police immediately to report identity theft. As I was gathering documentation for the police report, I noticed something that made me deeply suspicious. Several of the credit card applications had been submitted from my parents' home IP address, which I could see in the digital footprint information the credit card companies provided. I drove to my parents' house unannounced and confronted them about the fraudulent accounts. At first, they claimed to know nothing about it and acted shocked that Tyler would have done something like this. But as I pressed them with specific evidence, including the IP address information and the timing of applications that correlated with periods when Tyler had been visiting them, their story started to fall apart. My mother eventually broke down and admitted that they'd known Tyler was using my information to open credit accounts. She said Tyler had been desperate for money and that they'd allowed him to use their computer to fill out credit applications in my name. They justified this by saying that I was co-signed on his apartment lease anyway, so it wasn't really that different from what I'd already agreed to do. They claimed they'd planned to tell me about it eventually, and had expected Tyler to pay off the debts before I ever found out. My father added that they'd thought of it as Tyler accessing family resources that I had, but he didn't. They genuinely seemed to believe that my better credit and income meant that these resources were somehow family assets that should be shared with Tyler when he needed them. They said I'd already been giving Tyler money regularly, so using my credit was just a more efficient way of accessing the same family support. I was stunned by their rationalization. They'd allowed my brother to commit identity theft and fraud against me, destroying my credit and sticking me with tens of thousands of dollars in debt. And they'd framed it as normal family resource sharing, rather than the serious crime it actually was. I asked them where all the money had gone. My parents weren't entirely sure, but they knew Tyler had used it for various expenses, including his apartment rent, during months he couldn't afford it, a car purchase, expensive electronics, vacation trips, and general lifestyle expenses. None of it had gone to emergencies or necessities. It had funded Tyler's lifestyle beyond what his actual income could support. I also discovered that all the times my parents had asked me to send Tyler money for supposed emergencies, there often hadn't been real emergencies. They'd been helping Tyler maintain the fiction that he needed legitimate help, rather than revealing that he was already stealing from me through credit fraud. The $35,000 I'd willingly given Tyler had been in addition to the $70,000 he'd stolen through fraudulent accounts. When I confronted Tyler directly, he was defensive and blamed me for not being more generous with family support. He said I was selfish for living a comfortable life in San Francisco, while he struggled in Sacramento. He claimed that I'd had advantages he never had, better grades that led to scholarships, career opportunities in tech, and generally better luck. He seemed to genuinely believe that he was entitled to access my financial resources because life had been unfair to him. Tyler's justification for the identity theft was that he'd planned to pay everything back once his career took off. He said he'd been using my credit as a temporary bridge loan to fund his lifestyle until he could get a better job and income. He couldn't understand why I was so upset since he'd intended to repay everything eventually, even though he'd never made payments on multiple accounts and had let them go into default. I filed a police report documenting the identity theft and fraud. The detective assigned to my case explained that these family member identity theft cases are tragically common and often difficult to prosecute because victims are reluctant to press charges against relatives. He encouraged me to pursue criminal charges against Tyler to have any hope of recovering financially and clearing the fraudulent debt from my credit report. Pressing charges against my own brother was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made, but I realized I had no choice. The fraudulent debt was destroying my financial life. I couldn't qualify for a mortgage, couldn't get approved for a car loan, and was even at risk of having my security clearance at work affected by the poor credit score. Without a criminal identity theft report and charges against Tyler, the credit card companies and lenders wouldn't remove the fraudulent accounts from my credit history. My parents were furious with me for pressing charges against Tyler. They said I was destroying our family over money and that I was being vindictive and cruel. They couldn't understand why I wouldn't just pay off the debts and move on rather than sending my brother to jail. They truly believed that family loyalty should override the fact that Tyler had committed serious crimes against me. The legal process was long and painful. Tyler was eventually charged with multiple counts of identity theft and fraud. He pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 18 months in jail, followed by probation. He was also ordered to pay restitution of $70,000 for the fraudulent debts, though realistically, he'll never be able to repay that amount, given his limited income and criminal record. Even with Tyler's conviction, clearing the fraudulent accounts from my credit report took over a year. I had to provide documentation to every creditor, proving that the accounts were fraudulent, file disputes with all 3 credit bureaus, and deal with collections agencies that were skeptical about my identity theft claims. Some creditors initially refused to remove the debts and required multiple rounds of documentation and legal threats. The financial impact extended beyond the fraudulent debt itself. I'd been saving for a down payment on a condo, but my ruined credit meant I couldn't qualify for a mortgage for several years. I missed out on the San Francisco real estate market during a period when prices were relatively affordable, and now I'm priced out of home ownership indefinitely. The identity theft probably cost me at least $200,000 in lost home equity appreciation alone. My relationship with my parents is permanently damaged. They still believe I overreacted and should have handled the situation privately within the family rather than involving the police. They can't acknowledge that they enabled Tyler's criminal behavior and violated my trust by allowing him to use my identity while keeping it secret from me. In their minds, I'm the one who broke family loyalty by pressing charges against Tyler. I haven't spoken to Tyler since his conviction. He sent me a few letters from jail, claiming he'd learned his lesson and asking for forgiveness. But the letters were focused more on his own suffering and hardship than on genuine remorse for what he'd done to me. He still seemed to think of himself as the victim of unfair circumstances, rather than taking responsibility for deliberately committing fraud against his own sister. That's the end of that story. My brother systematically destroyed my credit and stole over $70,000 from me, while our parents enabled the fraud because they believed family resources should be shared regardless of consent or legality. The experience taught me that family loyalty can be weaponized to enable terrible behavior, and that sometimes protecting yourself requires enforcing legal boundaries, even against family members. Our final story reveals how workplace friendships can create blind spots that allow someone to operate right under your nose, building something that directly threatens everything you've helped create. I'm 37, and my name is Marcus. I work as the operations director for a regional event planning company that specializes in corporate events and conferences. We have a team of 12 people handling everything from initial client consultations to event execution. I've been with the company for 9 years and helped build it from a small startup into a successful business generating about $2 million in annual revenue. 2 years ago, we hired Angela as a senior event coordinator. She came with excellent references and about 6 years of industry experience. From the beginning, Angela was impressive, organized, creative, great with clients, and genuinely enjoyable to work with. She and I developed a close working friendship. We'd often grab lunch together, brainstorm client solutions, and share our frustrations and aspirations about the event planning industry. Angela frequently talked about her long-term career goals. She said she eventually wanted to start her own event planning business, but was focused on learning as much as possible first. She'd ask me detailed questions about how our company operated, from client acquisition strategies to vendor relationships to pricing structures. I was happy to share information because I thought of Angela as a trusted colleague and mentee who was years away from starting her own venture. About 6 months into her time with us, Angela started asking more specific questions about our business operations. She wanted to know details about our profit margins, our most valuable client relationships, and which vendors gave us the best rates and service. She'd frame these questions as being curious about the business side of event planning to help her eventually run her own company someday in the distant future. I shared information freely because I trusted Angela and believed in mentoring people in our industry. I explained how we structured our contracts, what our overhead costs were, and which aspects of event planning were most profitable. I even shared information about clients who were difficult to work with and which corporate accounts were most valuable to our company. Around this same time, Angela started volunteering to take on more client-facing work and vendor relationship management. She'd asked to be the primary contact for new clients and would offer to handle vendor negotiations. This seemed like positive initiative and professional development, so I encouraged her increased involvement in these areas. About 10 months into her employment, I started noticing some small irregularities in Angela's work patterns. She'd frequently be on personal phone calls that she'd quickly end when people walked by her desk. She'd stay late at the office alone, supposedly working on client proposals, but the proposals she'd produce didn't seem to reflect the number of hours she'd claimed to work on them. She'd also started taking her laptop home more frequently, saying she wanted to work on projects over the weekends. Angela began scheduling unusual numbers of coffee meetings and lunches with contacts she described as potential vendors or industry networking. She'd be out of the office several times per week for these meetings, always with reasonable explanations about building relationships that could benefit our company. I didn't question this because client development and vendor relationships are crucial in event planning. Around month 14 of her employment, one of our long-term vendors mentioned to me that Angela had been asking detailed questions about their pricing structure and capacity for taking on new clients. The vendor thought it was odd that Angela was asking about hypothetical large volume bookings beyond what our company typically required. When I asked Angela about it, she said she'd been exploring whether we could negotiate better rates based on committing to higher volumes. 2 months before Angela resigned, she started becoming more distant and less collaborative with our team. She'd work independently rather than participating in our usual team planning sessions. She'd be vague about client meetings and project details. When I'd ask her about specific events she was coordinating, she'd give minimal information rather than the detailed updates she'd previously provided. Angela submitted her resignation with 2 weeks' notice about 4 months ago. She said she'd been offered a position at a larger event planning company in a nearby city and that it was too good an opportunity to pass up. She claimed the new position would give her valuable experience working on much larger events and with bigger corporate clients. She seemed genuinely sad to leave and said she'd miss working with me and our team. During her 2-week notice period, Angela's behavior became even more unusual. She'd have private conversations with other team members, often suggesting they step outside or go grab coffee to talk. She was spending significant time on her personal phone and laptop during work hours. She also asked for copies of various company documents, claiming she wanted to take examples of our work for her portfolio. On Angela's last day, She asked if she could make a brief announcement to the team during our weekly staff meeting. I agreed, thinking she wanted to say goodbye and thank everyone for working with her. What happened instead was shocking. Angela stood up and announced that she hadn't actually taken a job at another event planning company. She'd spent the past year building her own competing event planning business and was now ready to launch publicly. Angela then proceeded to pitch her new company to our entire team. She explained that she was offering positions to anyone interested in joining her, with promises of higher salaries, better benefits, and equity stakes in the new venture. She said she already had secured commitments from several major clients and vendors, and that her new company would be directly competing with our business in the same market. Angela specifically targeted our most talented employees with personalized pitches about why they should join her company instead of staying with ours. She'd clearly researched what each person's frustrations were and tailored her recruitment approach to address their specific concerns. She'd been cultivating these conversations during her final weeks, testing people's interest in leaving before making her public pitch. The audacity of using her final company meeting to recruit our entire team to her competing business was breathtaking. She'd systematically gathered competitive intelligence for over a year, built relationships with our clients and vendors while employed by us, and now was trying to gut our team on her way out the door. After Angela left the office, I immediately started investigating the full scope of what she'd done. I discovered that Angela had been meeting with our clients for months, often scheduling calls and meetings during times she'd claimed to be working on company business. She'd been positioning herself as the key relationship manager and subtly suggesting that she'd be starting her own venture soon where she could provide even better service. I found evidence that Angela had copied extensive company files to her personal cloud storage, including client lists, vendor contracts, pricing information, event planning templates, and strategic business documents. She'd essentially stolen our entire operational playbook to use as the foundation for her competing business. Most disturbing was learning that Angela had convinced 3 of our clients to sign letters of intent to work with her new company once it launched. These were significant accounts, representing about $400,000 in annual revenue. She'd been negotiating these agreements while still employed by us and being paid to manage these client relationships on our behalf. Angela had also been approaching our vendors with proposals to work with her new company, often suggesting that she'd be able to bring them more business than our company provided. Several vendors had agreed to give Angela preferential pricing and terms, effectively giving her a competitive advantage over the company where she still worked. The legal implications were severe. Angela had violated her employment agreement's confidentiality and non-compete clauses. She'd stolen proprietary business information and had been operating a competing business while employed by us, which was explicitly forbidden by her contract. She'd also potentially engaged in tortious interference by convincing clients to breach contracts with our company to work with her instead. We immediately consulted with an attorney who specialized in employment law and trade secrets. The lawyer confirmed that Angela had violated multiple legal obligations and recommended that we pursue legal action to protect our business. We filed for an emergency injunction to prevent Angela from using our confidential information and to enforce the non-compete agreement that prohibited her from competing in our market for 18 months. The legal battle was expensive and time-consuming. Angela fought the injunction, claiming that she had a right to use her general industry knowledge and relationships to start her own business. She argued that the non-compete agreement was overly broad and unenforceable. Her position was that everything she'd learned during her employment was now her personal knowledge that she could use freely. The court ultimately granted a partial injunction. Angela was prohibited from using specific proprietary information like our pricing structures, client lists, and business planning documents. She was also forbidden from soliciting our employees for 6 months and from contacting clients she'd worked with while employed by us for 12 months. However, the court found that the full 18-month non-compete was too restrictive and reduced it to 9 months. Despite the injunction, significant damage had been done to our business. Two of our best event coordinators did eventually leave to join Angela's company after the 6-month employee solicitation restriction expired. We lost 3 major clients who decided to work with Angela despite the legal restrictions, claiming they had the right to choose their service provider regardless of our legal dispute. The financial impact on our company was substantial. We lost approximately 30% of our revenue over the following year due to Angela's competing business and the employees who left to join her. We had to spend over $60,000 in legal fees, pursuing the injunctions and defending our business interests. The distraction and stress of the legal battle also affected our ability to serve remaining clients and pursue new business. I felt personally betrayed because I'd trusted Angela as a close work friend and had mentored her extensively. Every piece of information I'd shared about our business operations, every introduction I'd made to clients and vendors, every insight I'd offered about managing an event planning company had been used to build a competing business designed to destroy what I'd helped create. Angela's new company did achieve some initial success by essentially copying our business model and stealing our clients and employees. However, within about 18 months, her business was struggling. She'd underestimated the operational challenges of running an event planning company and had made various strategic mistakes that our company had learned to avoid through years of experience. Several of the employees who'd left to join her became disillusioned and tried to return to our company. We've slowly rebuilt our business over the past 2 years, but we never fully recovered the revenue and team cohesion we had before Angela's betrayal. The experience taught me to be much more cautious about sharing sensitive business information, even with employees I consider friends and trusted colleagues. That's the end of that story. Angela used our friendship and my mentorship to systematically gather everything she needed to build a competing business while still collecting a salary from us. She treated our entire company as her free business school and resource library, then tried to destroy us on her way out the door. That's all for tonight. 7 stories about people who had your trust and used it to systematically exploit you. Business partners, family, lawyers, colleagues. Turns out the people with the most access are sometimes the most dangerous. If these made you want to audit every relationship in your life, good. That's probably healthy. Subscribe for more stories like these, and drop a comment about which betrayal was the worst in your opinion. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.